We had been answering the question that the young rich man had asked Christ, "What must we do to have everlasting life?" And we are studying the answer that Jesus Christ has given. And we mentioned the fact that his answers are found in the Gospels. We mentioned the fact also that the writers of the Gospel made sure that the answer of Jesus Christ was not set in the proper order, so that those who are not truly seeking God will be confused by the answer of Jesus Christ. However, Holy Mother of the Church, in her liturgy, had arranged all the answer of Jesus Christ in such a way that it is in the proper order. In other words, we must know what is the first thing we must do, the second thing we must do, the third thing we must do, the fourth and the fifth, and so forth and so on. And this is laid down in what you call the liturgy of the Mass. We have seen on the first Sunday what we must do to have everlasting life. And the first lesson taught to us by the Gospel is for us to stay awake. Now, when the Gospel tells us to stay awake, it means that our minds and our free will should be awake. Not our eyelids, but our minds and our free will. To stay awake in our minds and free will is to be conscious of what is going on around us all the time and to be aware of what God is teaching us. During the second Sunday of Advent, having waited for the messenger and precursor of God to come down from the high mountain to teach us how to climb the mountain and be instructed there in the mountain, the liturgy is telling us to prepare our way, to make a path straight that leads towards the height of the mountain, to make our way straight. And then the third Sunday of Advent began to teach us how to identify the precursor of Christ who would come to teach us the way that leads to the mountain. He was described as John the Baptist. And then who will be our instructor in the mountain? And that is Jesus Christ, who would come from the tribe of Jesse. We are reminded that Jesus Christ precisely and specifically will come from the roots of Jesse and not from the other children of Abraham and Isaac. The third Sunday of Advent describes to us the Catholic Church as the desert. The desert has always been a symbol of the Catholic Church. If you will notice in the book of Revelation, the woman, which is described as the great woman, the great sign that appeared in the sky, fled to the desert and stayed in the desert in a special place prepared by God Himself for her. Now that is the Catholic Church, the woman in the desert. That's the reason why in the third Sunday of Advent, the desert in the first reading has been described as blooming and flowering, because that is the Catholic Church blooming with virtues, different kinds of flower, different kinds of virtue. This is the reason precisely why in the first Christian era, the first Christians in trying to learn the teachings of Jesus Christ all fled to the desert. In fact, if anybody would ask anyone Where is the Catholic Church? They would always point to the desert, or of course to the forests or the mountaintops and so on. But more symbolically, the desert had been used as a place where the Catholic Church grows. And so in the psalm, we always mention the desert. And the first Christians always went to the desert. The hermits were found in the desert. The monastic movement, which is nothing else except laymen trying to seek the kingdom of God, worked their salvation in the desert. Now, when we say desert in the Catholic Church, we do not mean the physical desert. The desert had been very well described by St. John Chrysostom as a way of life in which you put all the teachings of Christ into practice, where you put into practice all the teachings of Christ that will make you deserving of everlasting life. That is a desert. Physically, the desert is not really the physical desert that we know. The monasteries had always been described as the desert life. And therefore, the second and the third Sundays of Advent describes to us John the Baptist as living in the desert and coming from the desert, and as a voice coming from the desert. And the third Sunday of Advent describes to us the beauty of the desert. That is the Catholic Church. And so, the second Sunday of Advent, we are asking Christ, what must we do to have everlasting life? And Christ answered, make a straight path towards the desert. Now, what is this straight path? It is the removal of every stimuli that would give pleasure to our senses, to our concupiscence. It's practically what Christ says to go home, sell all your things and give it to the poor. Or as Christ also said somewhere in the Gospel, not to be friendly with the things of the world. So it is the giving up of the pleasures of the flesh. And therefore, we have to give up everything that is worldly, that are bound really to satisfy the pleasures of the flesh. In the desert, that precisely is what happens. There is absolutely nothing in the desert that can please our flesh. It is a place really that is really conducive for the mind, for the faculties of the soul, the free will, in search for God. That is the third Sunday of Advent. And then before the fourth Sunday of Advent, in between we have a feast, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Now, the feasts of the liturgy are very essential in understanding the season in which the feast is found. Like the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is found within Advent. Also, the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe is found within the season of Advent. This is of the utmost importance because it enhances the meaning of the message of Jesus Christ during that season. And so, for instance, when we study the Gospel on the necessity of having wisdom and knowledge in order to attain everlasting life, We celebrate also the feasts of St. Thomas of Aquinas or St. Albert the Great. So you cannot set aside the commemoration of the feasts of the saints and the feasts of the Blessed Virgin Mary that falls on certain seasons because they enhance the message of Christ during those seasons. And during Advent, if you will notice, there is the celebration of the Immaculate Conception, a very important feast. Why? Because it summarizes the message of Advent. What is the message of Advent? The message of Advent is you must be prepared for the first coming of Christ, and you must be prepared for the second coming of Christ. Essentially, the way to prepare for the first and the second coming of Christ are identical. Identical. There is only a difference in degree. And so the Immaculate Conception tells us that we should begin our spiritual life by being handmaid of the Lord. Handmaid of the Lord, part of the prayer of the Magnificat of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which means that we have to be very humble. Handmaid, we must be slaves, servants, beggars. And then the end and our goal is to be immaculate like the Blessed Virgin Mary. So the Catholic Church should begin being a handmaid of the Lord, a humble handmaid of the Lord, and must eventually become Immaculate Conception. Not exactly conception, but immaculate when they die. Thus, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is found within the season of Advent because it summarizes and enhances the message of Advent, which is we must prepare ourselves by living the spirituality of the Old Testament and end up by living the perfection of the spirituality of the New Testament.